before Sherlock Holmes ever solved a case. Joseph Bell was doing something that would look like a parlor trick if it wasn't so clinically useful. He would bring a patient into the room, and in front of a full class, he would start telling a story about them. When people say Sherlock Holmes, they usually mean one of two things. They either mean the character, the coat, the pipe, the one-liners, the pop culture version, or they mean a superhuman brain, that ability to look at a stranger and somehow know things that you really shouldn't know. And that's usually where the conversation gets weird, because the moment you say, I can read people, half the world hears, I can do magic. So let me open this series with a claim. A claim that sounds dramatic, but is actually the opposite of dramatic. Sherlock Holmes wasn't invented. He was assembled. Doyle didn't wake up one day and just conjure a genius out of thin air. He took real methods, real habits, real professional disciplines, and fused them into a character. And the first, arguably most important piece of that assembly was a real man in Edinburgh, a surgeon, a lecturer, a professional observer. His name was Dr. Joseph Bell. Quick pause as I stand here before you resplendent in my Gomez attire. Mostly because this matters. Everything we're talking about in this series only works if your mind can hold on to information properly. Observation, pattern recognition, deduction. They all collapse if your memory isn't reliable. That's why I built MindForge. It's a 30-day training program focused on one thing. Teaching you how to encode, retain, and retrieve information under pressure. Deliberately, not passively. Not speed reading, not tricks. It's actual cognitive training. So if you want the Sherlock skills in this series to become usable, rather than just interesting, that's where it starts. You can find it at omniscientinsights.com/mindforge or here. Now, back to the real story. Before Sherlock Holmes ever solved a case, Joseph Bell was doing something that would look like a parlor trick if it wasn't so clinically useful. He would bring a patient into the room, and in front of a full class, he would start telling a story about them, where they'd been, what kind of work they did, what injuries they'd had, sometimes what habits they had. And then he'd ask them to confirm it. Not because he wanted applause, because he wanted his students to learn the one skill medicine demanded more than anything else at that time. Observation before interpretation. And there's a reason this matters to us today. In investigations and protective work, behavioral assessment, interviewing, even leadership. Because most people don't fail due to a lack of intelligence. They fail because they solve the person too early. They decide what they're looking at before they've even really looked. Bell trained the opposite. So in this episode, I'm going to give you who Joseph Bell was, how exactly he influenced Doyle and the Holmes method at large, this skill set that Bell was really teaching, and a practical way to apply it today, without turning into the bloke who thinks that he can read souls just because someone scratched their nose. So who was Joseph Bell? That really matters, because a Victorian surgeon wasn't just a doctor. They were operating in a world where diagnostic certainty was harder, and consequences were immediate. There were no CT scans, no MRI, no blood panels the way we think of them now, no quick lab confirmations for everything or anything. If you wanted to figure out what was wrong with someone, you couldn't outsource the thinking to a machine. You had two tools, essentially. Your senses and your reasoning. So Bell's world demanded a kind of attention most modern people don't naturally practice. And he didn't just practice it. He taught it. He trained medical students to notice the hands, signs of repeated work or chemical staining or wear patterns. With the walk, there is the uneven gait, the stiffness or pain avoidance. With the accent and speech, there is region and education, maybe stress. The clothing, there is quality, there is the stitching, there is repair work, there is practical needs. With the posture, there is confidence or fatigue or injury or defensiveness of some sort. And here's the point. Bell wasn't guessing. He was narrowing the field. He wasn't saying, I feel like you're a carpenter. He was saying that your hands show repetitive friction in a pattern that is consistent with tool use, and your posture suggests long-term physical strain. That's not mystical. That's professional literacy. And that's why Bell is widely considered to be the blueprint, because his method is the skeleton of what we later call Holmesian deduction. How does Bell connect to Conan Doyle and then, by extension, to Sherlock Holmes? Doyle wasn't just vaguely aware of him. Doyle was his student and worked with him as a clerk, meaning he didn't just hear the lectures. He saw Bell up close, repeatedly, in real situations. And later, after Sherlock Holmes was already a phenomenon, Doyle wrote to Bell and made the connection explicit, stating, "It is most certainly to you that I owe Sherlock Holmes." That line is gold, because it prevents us from doing what the internet loves to do, which is turning inspiration into a mythology. This is not, maybe Bell influenced him. Doyle tells you, Bell is where Holmes comes from. So when Holmes does that thing where he looks at Watson and says, "You've been in Afghanistan," the method behind that isn't magic writing. It's Bell. Now, it is important to be honest. Doyle dramatized it. He sharpened it. He made it cleaner, quicker, and more entertaining. But the operating system is essentially the same. You observe small facts. You infer carefully. You test, and then you update as needed. But here's where most people misunderstand the Sherlock-style thinking. They think that deduction means I look at you and I instantly know who you are. No. Deduction means I can describe what I can verify, then I build a hypothesis that remains vulnerable to disconfirmation. It's understandably not as sexy, but it is true. So let me show you what Bell was effectively training using a modern demonstration. Imagine that someone walks into a room. Their shoes are heavily worn on the outer edge of the heel. Their right hand has a faint staining around the fingertips. Their jacket sleeve on the dominant side has more abrasion. They keep shifting their weight from left to right. Now, that's not a personality profile. That's not their star sign. That's just a description. Now, the inference layer. Plausible explanations, not certainty. Outer heel wear might indicate gait mechanics, posture issues, or long-term movement patterns. The finger staining, depending upon the color, could be nicotine, ink, grease, dyes, certain chemicals. Sleeve abrasion could be repeated contact with surfaces, with work environments, habits. Weight shifting could be discomfort, anxiety, injury, impatience, poor footwear, some kind of combination. Now notice what I didn't do. I didn't say he's anxious. I didn't say he's lying. I didn't say he is a mechanic. Because the moment you do that, you stop observing and you start defending. Bell trained students to hold the mind open long enough to gather more information. So the next step is testing. You ask 1 or 2 questions. You look for more data. You check the environment and you update. This is why Bell could appear uncannily accurate. He wasn't shooting one dramatic arrow. He was building a scaffold of small truths. Sherlock Holmes as a character makes this look like a lightning strike. Bell did it like a surgeon. Controlled, cumulative, methodical. The other key piece, and it's the piece that most people don't want, is the willingness to update. Bell didn't just teach look harder. He taught be less emotionally attached to your first conclusion. In modern terms, he trained resistance to a first impression bias, to a cognitive bias, to narrative lock-in, to premature closure. But here's what humans do naturally. We see one clue and we form a story. And then we start selectively noticing that evidence protects the story. Bell trained the opposite sequence. Observe, infer, test, update. And that update part is where professionals separate from amateurs. If you're in an investigative conversation and you think you've got someone in the first 2 minutes, you're not ahead. You're compromised. Bell's method keeps your cognition flexible, and flexibility is what keeps you accurate when the situation changes. So what do we take from Joseph Bell that still matters right now? 3 practical lessons. Lesson number 1. Your job is description first. In interviews, assessment, protective environments, intelligence gathering, most people start with interpretation. They hear a tone and decide it's hostile. They see a posture and decide it's guilty. They see a delay and decide it's somehow deceptive. Bell would tell you, slow down. Start with what you can describe, not what you can accuse. Long pause before answering. The eyes down when recalling a sequence, the hands fidgeting after specific topics have been introduced. That's professional language. Lesson 2. Build hypotheses that can die. If your conclusion can't die, it isn't analysis, it's a kind of identity. And good hypothesis is like a temporary working model. It should be easy to discard when new data arrives. Bell didn't need to be right immediately. He needed to be right eventually. That's the mindset. And lesson 3, accuracy beats speed every time. In our roles, and by extension in society, the temptation is to be fast. Fast judgment, fast reads, fast certainty. But fast certainty is often just confidence wearing a disguise. Bell reminds us that discipline looks slow to observers until it wins. And if you want a clean phrase for this series, it's this. Bell wasn't teaching deduction, he was teaching cognitive hygiene. Now here's the detail that I really love about Bell. He sometimes assisted police with real cases, but he often didn't want credit. He believed being publicly associated with crime solving distracted from medicine and professionalism. Which is hilarious, because the world remembers him primarily as the mind behind Sherlock Holmes, the man who inspired the most famous, arguably, detective in history. Didn't want the detective label. He wanted the standard. He wanted students who could see properly. Sherlock Holmes wasn't special because he was fictional. He was special because his method was real. And Joseph Bell proved it could be taught, not as a gimmick, not as body language analysis videos, but as disciplined observation and disciplined updating. And in a world full of noise, speed, and lazy certainty, that discipline is still a competitive advantage. Coming up, we move from Bell's observational foundation to something that changed investigations forever. The shift from "I think" to "I can prove." Because the next real Sherlock didn't just observe people. He helped to build the early foundations of forensic thinking.